Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Well, it was interesting to see and hear Mark's presentation. Made me nostalgic talking about yesterday, earlier life. I wrote a book 40 years ago about Mongolia, and it really has changed. I would say Mongolia was famous at the time for being the only nomadic communist country. Literally, it was a completely nomadic economy, but they had a communist political system. The other thing which made me nostalgic was the skating. I was a passionate speed skater as a young man. My third comment on that one was, of course, that if some politicians, an increasing number, I'm afraid, including the American president, might feel that this Marshall Plan film was a kind of globalization propaganda, which we should absolutely avoid today. Well, these are my comments on Marx. We are going to speak now a little bit about film from a Swedish point of view. I notice in the program that there will be nothing about opera, and of course next year I will offer that, because that is a field which I know. Film, I'm only, well, an interested spectator, and have nothing particularly to contribute, except that film really, as Mark indicated, film really is and has been and will be probably an instrument in cultural diplomacy, both for nation branding and at a very individual level. Simply we get our impressions very much through film. And I will make some reflections on that, give some examples. I'm not going to show you any film. I think we should speak about it now for a moment. So we are right now in the weeks of Berlinale, and of course the Berlinale is one of the big festivals in the world. A little bit special, they say. They say that Berlinale goes a little bit more for so-called quality film, rather than the blockbusters, perhaps. But of course, it has in common with all other festivals that it's very much about celebrities. We have the red carpet, and the celebrities are coming there, and there's an enormous, and this is the common thing about film, and that is what makes film so efficient comparatively, in comparison, for instance, with classical music or with some other events. It has an enormous publicity. The communication on, about, and from film is very strong because of the interest of media in connection with a festival. So we have the Cannes, of course, the same phenomena, the Cannes Festival taking place in May, and we have the Venice Festival, which is also a very big, a very spectacular event. Many of us are familiar with the Ouagadougou Festival, which is the biggest and the most important African festival, I think it is without competition the most important African film festival. And then we have, for instance, the Sundance Festival in Utah, in Salt Lake City. Does anybody know why it is called Sundance Festival, by the way? No, it's because the founder of it was Robert Redford. And Robert Redford became world famous through the classic film Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid. So through that film, because of that, they called the film festival, which he was very much supporting, the Sundance Festival. And then, of course, we have, in a few weeks' time, the Academy Awards, which we all call the Oscar. And that is, of course, the kind of Nobel Prize of film, so with an enormous prestige level. the publicity, the communication around film is impressive and therefore very, very efficient as a kind of instrument of cultural diplomacy. The history of film, it has been growing, but I think we should note, I had the pleasure of reading my grandfather's little notes in his calendar 100 years ago, where it was quite evident that going to the cinema 100 years ago was a very big thing. Because of course it was rather new that you could see these moving pictures, which you haven't seen before. You know, it was Edison, or it was the Lumiere brothers, or it was some German guy. They are still competing about who was the first to do real film in a modern sense somehow. But anyway, we're speaking about 125 or 130 years ago when the first cinema opened around 1895. So, and then we had the fascinating period which really attracted people to this new phenomena of culture event, the silent films, and with genius people like Charlie Chaplin and so on. And we have had, are you familiar with the great icon film, Battleship Potemkin? Yeah, Sergei Eisenstein. You know that scene. What am I referring to? Which film? Which scene? Yes, which one?
The baby wagon.
With the baby carriage, right? Down the stair, right, exactly. And that has been copied and quoted so many times through film history, and everybody, yeah, that's Potemkin. Yeah, that famous staircase in Odessa next to the Black Sea. So Eisenstein is really one of the great innovators of film. We are speaking now Soviet time, 1920s. Then come the 30s and 40s, and the interesting thing perhaps for film creativity was the fact that because of the Nazi period here in Germany and Europe, so many genius Jewish people who were filmmakers left Germany or Hungary or Poland or Czechoslovakia and so on. They left and they went west. They went to America, and they became important. They had other names here, but they became Billy Wilder. They became Michael Curtiz. Michael Curtiz, the guy who directed Casablanca, for instance. But his original name was Michael Kertész. He was Hungarian. There's a story about a group of such Hungarian immigrant filmmakers sitting at a coffee table in somewhere in Hollywood and loudly speaking in German, in Hungarian. And there's Billy Wilder at another table, and he says, after being a little bit disturbed by this Hungarian shouting around at the next table, so all of a sudden he said, "Meine Herren, wir sind in Hollywood. Hier spricht man Deutsch." Yeah. So that was the case, that the German speaking community was so much dominating the Hollywood film in the 30s and far into the 40s, the emigration generation of that time. Then, of course, in film history, there are a few very important landmarks. Of course, the Nouvelle Vague, La Nouvelle Vague Française, with Godard and Truffaut and others. And we had the fantastic Italian period from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s with the Fellini films and Antonioni films and many others. And we had a rather important period of Swedish filmmaking as well, and I'm coming to this now. So, first of all, I show you this picture, and perhaps not all in the student generation would recognize this lady, but perhaps somebody who has been around a little longer time could tell me who that is. That is Greta Garbo, exactly. And this is a new name for some of you, but Greta Garbo is still legendary. Anybody who has some interest in film, for anybody, she is the absolute icon of woman actress and protagonist in film, the diva. She was the protagonist in so many important films. Some are very high quality, some others are more mediocre quality, but all being extremely well successful in the market, and her popularity was enormous. Now, the interesting thing, because she became and still is a kind of a myth, and the recipe for becoming a myth, I would say, is you should all of a sudden stop doing what you have been doing, and if possible, even disappear without dying. If you're dying, you're a martyr, but if you disappear, you become a myth. She spent the rest of her life. The interesting thing, this lady was born in 1905, so she made her career in her 20s and 30s. And just before, perhaps a year before her 40th birthday, so in 1943-44, she made her very last film, which is quite unusual. Everybody knew that she was still a very beautiful woman, perhaps the most beautiful woman in the world, she was considered, kind of. But she stopped filming. She remained the symbol of Swedish beauty, which is perhaps not so well known anymore, but it used to be a very strong kind of selling argument for my country, Sweden, in cultural diplomacy. But anyway, she stayed on living in New York, for Manhattan, all her life. She spent a few weeks every winter in St. Moritz in the Swiss Alps. And I have a little story about that. I happened to be in New York at the end of the 1980s, a business travel to negotiate the Children's Convention of the United Nations, by the way, together with another well-known Swedish lady, Lisbeth Palme, who was the widow of Olof Palme, the prime minister who was murdered in Stockholm in 1986. So I was there with Lisbeth, and we had the great honor to meet Audrey Hepburn, who was a kind of a children's ambassador for the UNICEF, and played a role also in this children's convention. But here comes the story. One morning when we were on the way from our hotel to the United Nations house there, we were standing waiting for the green light, and all of a sudden Lisbeth is, Karl-Erik, have you seen who is there on the other side of the street? And I looked, and I saw a lady with her, like this, you know. The weather was rather gloomy, and in spite of the gloomy weather, she had black glasses, sunglasses. And immediately I saw, this is Greta Garbo, the old Greta Garbo, now in her late 80s. She was there, but she was, you know, every now and then paparazzis and others found her in some corner of the world and gave the world a little reminder about this Swedish myth. But we saw her live that particular morning in New York in the late 80s. Now, so here is another. I call her the hijacked star. She was a Swedish, very well-known singer with a very low voice. She had a voice which, for a woman, could be almost mixed up with a baritone, because she had an extremely low pitch. But was she singing very well? Was beautiful. Her name was Sara Leander, and at a certain stage in the 1930s. She was very popular, and it was time for her to take the step. She had already made some very successful operetta in Vienna as a guest star, but she had. It was now the time for her to take the step out to the international career, and she had, of course, an offer from Hollywood to come there, a very well-paid offer, but. At the same time, it so happened that Marlene Dietrich was one of those who had departed from Germany. She had left Germany and in protest against Hitler and the Nazis, and was starting to make a career abroad. She even took side with the Allied against Hitler in the war, as some of you will remember. So, but this left the propaganda minister of the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, with a big problem, because film was a very, very important instrument in the German Nazi propaganda. He needed a star. He needed a woman star. So he heard about and saw perhaps Sarah Leander, and he heard about the offer from Hollywood, and he doubled it. That was for him a self-evident thing. We will double it. Sarah was then in the dilemma. I don't think she had particularly strong political feelings about that, and at that time, we're speaking 1935, before the Berlin Olympics, etc., and not everybody had realized what the Nazis were really like, what they represented. Anyway, here was a mother of 2 children, divorced, in Sweden, with 2 offers. One very high, the other double so high. With Hollywood as one alternative, you don't fly at that time. You take the ship, and you have to spend 3 weeks at least to get from Stockholm to Los Angeles. The other alternative, take the train, one overnight, you're in Berlin, and better paid. So, and with the 2 children, etc. So she chose Babelsberg. Babelsberg was the film center, of course, of Nazi Germany. It's still the film center of Germany, and she became then the big star of Nazi Germany, although the films were not politically really, but they were almost so escapist kind of films that it gives you time to forget the everyday life and so on. Anyway, I usually compare her, talking about cultural diplomacy, I compare her sometimes with the Swedish government, which was a coalition government during the Second World War. In the autumn of 1942, Sarah Leander felt the wind has changed. Stalingrad was going to be a disaster for the Germans. The North Africa was going to was already a disaster, and it was evident that the end of this Nazi war would be coming sometime. So she drew the consequences. She didn't want to stay here in Grunewald in Berlin, where she lived. Interestingly enough, the Swedish government did the same decision, exactly the same month, as a matter of fact. It said, so we are now sending our best ambassador to London in order to negotiate iron ore deliveries to the Allied rather than to Germany. That, my friends, is called neutrality, a pragmatic neutrality, and it changed at the same time. Poor Sarah Leander, who wasn't worse, as a matter of fact, than the Swedish government, had to suffer from this for many years. because she had the reputation of being Goebbels or Hitler's favorite girl and so on. And of course, this it wasn't easy for her future or continued artistic career. She had that kind of stamp in her all her life. But it's an interesting story telling about the limits, the borders, and the gray zones between politics and culture and film. Now comes the very reason why I think it's worthwhile speaking about a film as culture diplomacy as a Swede. So this man with his characteristic hat is Ingmar Bergman, the great Swedish filmmaker who he died about 10 years ago. But he was active both in filmmaking until the 90s and on with stage productions until, as a matter of fact, into this century. Anyway, he had an enormous production of films that made a footprint everywhere, here and there. I can't go into all of these films here, but I mentioned them here. Torment, starting, that is about a very brutal teacher. And the way he is really tormenting his pupils. The Prison, another fascinating film. Summer with Monica was a great scandal because you saw naked people in it. And The Smiles of a Summer Night is, of course, a big classic. The Seventh Seal is about the plague in the 14th century. The Wild Strawberries, a very nostalgic film, beautiful film, where Bibi Andersson became the great world star, etc., etc., etc. It goes on here. Through a Glass Darkly, The Silence, also a film which was a scandal in countries who were a little bit more sensitive about naked breasts or and so on. Yeah. So you had also Scenes from a Marriage. I think you might have seen because this came in the 1970s and is also one of these films which is kind of quoted, referred to all the time because it's very general. It is the classic thing about a marriage, and of course he or she or both have affairs of their own, and it's a breakdown and so on. They made, as a matter of fact, only 10 years ago or 15 years ago, a kind of a remake 40 years afterwards about the film, which is available. So, one opera film he did, that was The Magic Flute, which was filmed in the Drottningholm Theatre, the old 18th century theatre outside Stockholm. The Autumn Sonata is a fascinating film, particularly for my family. My wife is a famous opera singer, and this Autumn Sonata is about a famous pianist and her daughter. The pianist played by Ingrid Bergman, by the way, the same Ingrid Bergman who was playing against Humphrey Bogart in Casablanca. So Ingrid Bergman, as a successful pianist, coming home to her daughter and her husband, the daughter being a more frustrated, kind of more amateur-like pianist and so on, always living in the shadow of the mother. My wife and I, we have still said we are not going to encourage our daughter to look at that film. Because it is, you have some of these lines according to, Mom, is it really necessary? Does it have to be so that a daughter hates her mother? Typical Bergman phrase. Fanny and Alexander is wild. It's perhaps the most lively of all his films. The others are rather gloomy. And the Autumn Sonata and Fanny and Alexander, as well as Magic Flute, of course, and Scene from Marriage, they are all color films. Almost all the others before are black and white. It was important for him, for various psychological reasons, I think, to make them black and white, to go black and white rather than in color. Now, so Bergman in cultural diplomacy. Mark referred to the fact that embassies have used films as cultural diplomacy, as kind of a nation branding. Well, that is true. I don't know how many times I have, in various places, in Moscow, in Peking, in Rome, and so on, had a load of, it was even before the VHS videos were there. So it became a big package like this, you know, and you installed that and you showed the film at the embassy, and you had people from the city coming and see. And you showed Ingmar Bergman, and you know, it was different. If you do it in Spain or Italy and Spain, I know, are full of Ingmar Bergman fans. But if you show it somewhere in Asia or in Africa, you will meet a certain astonishment. Is that Sweden? Kind of. Because there is so much psychology, there is so much melancholy, so much depression even, but always, or usually in 9 cases out of 10, made through a wonderful, a very close portrait of a woman. I'm always comparing 3 guys in the last 150 years who are specialists in portraying women in a very good psychological way. It's Sigmund Freud, of course, but it's also Richard Strauss with his operas, Salome, Electra, and such operas, and it's Ingmar Bergman. The male protagonists are very marginal, usually, both for Strauss and for Bergman and so on. They are not playing a main role. He wasn't so interested in that. To some extent, I can understand him. but because that is, of course, for us men, at least for us hetero men, the woman's psychology is a fascinating adventure. Phenomenon. And Bergman was fascinated that from the very beginning to the very end. I happen to have a sister who had contact with him in the very last years, and he was always on this theme and so on, you know. Another thing, he happened to be the son, just like Mark, you should hear this, Mark, is the son of a priest. And this evidently gave him a kind of a complex through his whole life, or he had big problems. And so the most interesting male portraits you find in Ingmar Bergman, they are a kind of a priest who has a permanent fight with God. God, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? And so on. Well, he ends up not believing in God. And I'm sure Bergman, at a rather relatively early stage, gave up. That's religion it's just a pressure on us. We have to free our minds somehow. But it came back all the time. How shall we relate to this guy up there? Another thing which is always coming back, of course, and which scandalized him, and which also contributed to a certain image of Sweden for a long time, that was all the sex scenes. That hadn't been so common before, but it became very common in the 1950s and 60s in some of his films. And it contributed to what was one of the Swedish images around the world in diplomacy was the Swedish sin. That sounded very interesting and sexy, of course. I declare the Swedish sin was over by the end of the 1970s, as a matter of fact, because other countries took over this role. You wouldn't find in a Swedish hotel room any pornography, for instance, or any of that. They are because the Swedes' interest in being good parents to the children and good models for them took over. Funnily enough, at the same time as the Queen, the German-Brazilian Queen Sylvia of Sweden came, and she is a rather, let's say, neo-moralist person. So she also didn't like that kind of tradition. Well, it changes it goes up and down. You still can see some film where some naked breast may appear, but it is not at all the time a kind of Klondike for sex and sin, which it might have appeared to be. Anyway, Ingmar Bergman, he symbolizes all these things: the darkness, the melancholy, the religious reflections, the sexuality, and the fascination in women. He is one of the super Swedes in history, to be compared with Björn Borg or Ingmar Stenmark, the ski downhill ski guy, or Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and so on. But he has a very strong position still abroad. Finally, on Bergman, there is, of course, by the way, we are celebrating 100 years this year. He was born in 1918, so this year there will be a lot of Bergman celebrations going on. New films will probably pop up here and there. And in that connection, of course, the Me Too debate is coming too. So how was it with Bergman and his relations, his physical relations to women? Well, he had 9 children with 4 or 5 different wives, and it's well known that all his protagonist actresses he had a relation with. That was quite clear, but he loved them for some time at least, and they loved him at least for some time. And this was the case, and I think it wasn't worse than that. No reason to moralize particularly about that, I think. Now, here's now the new look of Swedish film. Anybody seen her? Yes. That is Madame Noomi Rapace. And she was the protagonist, the fantastic protagonist, I think. Very seldom I see a film where I can say that the film really catches the personalities of a book, of a novel, which I have read. And that novel was Stieg Larsson's Millennium, 3 parts, about some very bad guys. And this rather half crazy kind of computer nerd, and also with certain other, let's say, psychological disturbances, you might say, but a fascinating person. And she was so absolutely 100% reflected by this Noomi Rapace. The 2 directors of these films were Nils Arden Oplev and Daniel Alfredsson twice. So I can, those who haven't seen it, I can really recommend. They came out all in the last 10 years or so. Another myth that which is still living, very much so, that is the detective novel myth. It seems that particularly here in Germany, if a detective story author comes from Sweden, he has a good, or she has a good chance to have success, because there is an enormous curiosity. I would say perhaps even exaggerated. Perhaps, I don't know if we are so good, but really it is they take it like this directly, and the biggest symbol, of course, is Mr. Wallander. You know, a depressive and a little bit drinking a little bit too much, and having a little bit of too much sugar in the blood, and you know, all these efforts, and divorced, of course, a problematic relation with his daughter, and you know, all this, and that is played fantastically by Lars Pasgård, who is here on this photo. Lasgård, sorry, it was Mankell who wrote this series of stories. Mankell, unfortunately, Henning Mankell, he died a few years ago, but had an enormous production. Had also a very strong fascination for Mozambique, where he stayed part of his life, his last 20 years. Interestingly enough, talking here about film, and so he happened to be married to one of Ingmar Bergman's 9 children. Eva Bergman. So also as a director, by the way, a fascinating woman. But we ask ourselves, what is the message? Many of you have seen some Wallander story, perhaps. Either the Swedish version is also a wonderful BBC or a British version with Kenneth Branagh as the Wallander there. He also makes this very well. What is the message here? The question is this Sweden promotion. The good guys. The big difference is, of course, that the good guys have so many problems. It's not very rosy. It's a kind of a qualification of every goodness in the films, which I think perhaps is rather typical of Swedish image making. A kind of an please don't say that we are so good, because we have that and that and that and that also. You know, our dark sides. Don't forget our dark sides, and they are very much present in these Wallander stories. So some could say or claim that this is a kind of the reverse of Swedish model. The Swedish model being the welfare society, the really good guys in development assistance, the internationally active in United Nations, etc. Country. And the open doors to refugees, and the gender equality, and of course a rather high standard of living. All these plus a preparedness to find compromises in whatever situation, a preparedness to compromise on the labor market or other, that has been called the kind of the secret of the Swedish success and the Swedish model. So, but the postmodern version, I might call this then, is that we question a lot of these things, and introduce a lot of the dark sides as well. So, summa summarum, I would say, after all, Wallander and all these films and the kind of gloomy detective stories, they are all a continuation of the Bergman message. There is a lot of psychological problems of melancholy, depression, etc., around the corner or under the carpet or in the cellar or wherever. So it goes on, this kind of image of Swedish mentality. Now, the big Swedish film brands is, of course, the Swedish Sin, which I mentioned, but which is rather belongs to the past history. Swedish left-wing film, I would say. A lot of productions from the 70s particularly, where you stress the equality aspect, or you attack the tendencies of rich people's abuse of their economic power, or political power for that sake. Psychology always psychology. It's no coincidence that we have such a big number and rather successful psychotherapists, etc., in Sweden, so that is a big issue. We are close to world champions in children's films, starting with the author Astrid Lindgren, of course, but and all her books have been filmed, and this is still a big trademark for Swedish film. And then the thriller Miracle, which I referred to. And then we have also in the multicultural Sweden, we have the new Swedes that I will call them. For instance, Josef Fares, born in Beirut, Lebanon, who has been very successful with a few films in recent years. We are closing, we are adding, coming to the close now. Just say that we all know about Hollywood. We know about Bollywood, the biggest of all filmmakers. We have Nollywood, they're wonderful Nigerian film production, low budget oft. And then we have, you don't know this problem, we have Trollywood. And Trollywood is, it was a car-making city, Trollhättan, in western Sweden. They were producing the Saabs, now owned by the Chinese and almost disappearing from the market. But anyway, the empty factories became the studios for filmmaking. So even, for instance, the great Danish film director, what's his name? Von Trier. He has shot several of his films in Trollywood. Now, finally, this is the very last, and there's some hope that The Square is another kind of scandal film because it puts the whole cultural debate upside down somehow in a very interesting manner. And there are certain hopes for an Oscar for this new film Square, which came a few months ago. Rather funny, rather interesting, I would say. But finally, very finally, there is something which I call slow film. If you look at Bergman, even if you look at Kaurismäki from Finland, if you look at von Trier, if you look at the Romanian filmmaker or East European and so on, we have all things in common. They are slower. They are slower. The European film has this in common as a difference from American film. And a friend of mine, István Szabó, a great Hungarian filmmaker, he got the question at a seminar which we had on culture, European culture, and he got the question, what is the difference, the real difference between American film and European film? And he said, well, American film is almost always about winners. European film is about losers or seekers. And that is why I love European film, because seeking, that is what it's all about. Thank you very much, and question, please.
We're going to move into the Q&A portion. So does anybody have any questions for Ambassador Karl-Erik Normann?
What's your favorite movie?
Oh, sorry, just a quick reminder. Before asking your question, could you please just say your name and where you're from?
Oh, cool. I'm Mon. Hi.
Hi, Mon.
Also the States. So what's your favorite film? Yeah.
Pardon?
What is your favorite film?
Oh, well, I'm afraid it will be something like Casablanca probably, but I should have thought of that this question might come. But I think one film which I love from the Bergman library, so to say, that would be Fanny and Alexander. It is a fantastic Swedish family film with all its complications. Three-quarters of them are divorced, of course, and it's upside down, it's chaotic. Well, it's a wonderful. Fanny and Alexandra, I would say yes.
We just have time for one last quick question right here in the front.
My name is Bożena. I'm coming from Kraków, Poland.
Ah,
And I have a question. Don't you think that if you explore one name, like Mankell or Ingmar Bergman, in cultural diplomacy, through diplomatic way, you explore because it's famous, because it's interesting,
Yeah.
etc. So of course you do it.
or because it's good.
Yeah, and it's suitable. You will have a lot of spectators, but that way you explore a certain subject or certain motives, and that it can create stereotypes of the nation. Yeah, as you also mentioned. Don't you think it's an old-fashioned cultural diplomacy? And there is a different way how we present ourselves through cultural diplomacy and present our culture.
No, absolutely. I should say that today, I guess that was partly in the title of my lecture here. Today, as a matter of fact, this is not really a conscious instrument of cultural diplomacy. It is rather what Mark was calling indirect cultural diplomacy, because the days are gone when you would take now a DVD with a Bergman film and send an invitation to your mailing list in the Swedish embassy in Berlin or even in Nairobi or wherever to say, now we are going to show the Square, the new Swedish film, or whatever. These days are more or less gone. It doesn't happen because the film industry lives from itself and so on. It is not conscious, let's say, government-controlled or government institution-controlled cultural diplomacy through film. No, that isn't the case anymore. But it happens anyway, and when these films are shown, they do give you a certain impression. And I was going to say, by the way, if today we had been actively showing Bergman films around, I'm afraid that many of the immigrants from southern countries who wanted to come to Sweden, they would have given this project a second thought, if you see my point. Because do I want to go to this dark, melancholic, depressive country, and be confronted with all these problems? I'm not sure that people would have taken the decision if they had based their knowledge on Sweden, on Bergman films, or even on Wallander films. So. Well,
that's all the time we have for the Q&A portion of today's talk. So please join me in thanking one more time Ambassador Karl.
Thank you very much.